Welcome everybody to today's presentation, which consists of analysis of qualitative data. This is featured in Chapter 11 of the Marlowe text. Today is going to be a little special because instead of being in class, we're watching this hopefully via YouTube or some other video processing application. I'm going to be walking through this with you as if we were still in class. So think of this more as a class that came to your home rather than you showed up at Sacramento State for it. Okay, let's try that. See if that works. This is also a little bit of an experiment to see if this can work in terms of being uploaded and carried out in this program. So I'll be very interested in finding out about feedback for this. So without further ado, I'm going to back up a little bit from where I was a week ago in class, which was largely looking at exclusively quantitative, which I want to back up just a little bit because I do think there's a lot in Chapter 11 that is worth looking at again, even if you've read it. It's good to review. I'm hoping that this presentation will give you some new perspectives or some examples that maybe you weren't able to get from the book, stimulate some new ideas about the material, anything that could be helpful. Okay, well, without any further ado, let's get going. First thing I want to go ahead and cover are the chapter objectives. The first, of course, is going to be to understand the similarities and differences between qualitative and quantitative data analysis. We already know a lot of the differences between qualitative and quantitative reasoning or approaches in general, but in terms of the data analysis, it really shouldn't be surprising that there's some pretty stark differences between those as well. Understand how to plan for analysis of qualitative data, which is structurally very different than planning for and carrying out quantitative data analysis. I want you to be able to identify categories within qualitative data. You'll see quite a few today. I want you to grasp the basic concepts for interpreting qualitative data, which the interpretation process itself is worth kind of studying for a minute. Understand principles of validating. That is very crucial. Validation of qualitative data is just not the same as validation of quantitative, where we have a lot of numbers, especially probability type of schematas to kind of gauge quantitative. We just don't have that with qualitative, and it requires a little more energy, a little more thoughtfulness about how to manage and validate the data. I want you to be able to recognize the principles for writing a research report. Okay, and that's, again, a little different with qualitative than in quantitative. And then finally, articulate ethical and human diversity issues, as we usually do at the end of each chapter. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these differences and similarities between qualitative and quantitative data analysis. Well, to begin, I think I can lay some things out here. Qualitative analysis is more difficult to define. With qualitative analysis, much more open-ended. We're not necessarily following a structured procedure the way we are with quantitative. There's also this term called interim analysis that's specific to qualitative analysis. Basically what it is you're analyzing the data before you're done collecting it. That's a lot. That is much a departure from quantitative, where you really do have to get all of the numbers in before you can kind of look at them and run an analysis. So again, this is a difference worth knowing. The second one on the slide here, qualitative analysis uses more of the researcher's direction and discretion. It's really something that needs to be considered throughout this entire chapter, because if something is less structured, as I've explained in class numerous times, it's more open to the researcher's discretion and thus values. Thus, while quantitative analysis is designed to guard against researchers' bias, it really is kind of a self-policing action for the researcher in a qualitative context. So something that really needs to kind of come through, I'm hoping. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Well, here we are now. Qualitative and quantitative analysis differ in their focus. Yeah, we've been covering this quite a bit throughout the course of the class. Qualitative data searches for patterns. We're looking for patterns in the data, specifically in patterns that are in context. You'll hear that a lot today. Quantitative data rather analyzes data for statistical significance. Usually we have a critical value and a calculated value that we're comparing, and the goal is to see whether or not statistical significance is achieved. Usually when a calculated value, which is the one you're doing math to get, is greater than some predefined critical value, which is something you usually find on a chart. Well, with qualitative data, we're also more interested in, in quantitative data, we're also more interested in generalizing outcomes to a larger population. This is just not important when we're talking about the same in qualitative data. It's just not quite the same focus. So again, these are two very different focuses with regard to the analyses of each perspective. Okay, qualitative data places a premium on context. Keeping the data in context, that basically means considering where, how, when, and by whom the data was collected to examine the patterns. This is all something that qualitative data is spending quite a bit of time fussing over. Quantitative, by contrast, is not necessarily as interested in the context as it is the frequencies, the numbers, the math. It's just not going to consider as much of the context as qualitative is, simply because what we're trying to do with quantitative is generalize to a much larger population. So we believe that if something's statistically significant, it should be able to be replicated just about anywhere. So again, context is not going to be nearly as important. Okay. Finally, qualitative analysis features inductive reasoning. This is something I covered on probably the first or second day of class this semester. And as mentioned in earlier chapters, qualitative analysis seeks to describe patterns, which can develop hypotheses. Quantitative analysis, by contrast, usually has some hypothesis in mind that it's trying to test. So you can kind of see this as processes that are traveling on different directions on a highway, if that helps you. With qualitative, we're looking at patterns to hopefully maybe formulate a hypothesis, whereas with quantitative, we're starting with a hypothesis and trying to test it with numbers. It's useful to also consider that, look at the third bullet point here, because qualitative data is grounded in real-world patterns, especially in a context, it is often referred to as grounded theory. And I've been noticing lately that that term has been getting a lot more recognition in circles of research. It's been described and been included a lot more regularly more recently. So those are some things that I think are really useful about, that is, to pay attention to from our text. Okay, moving forward, we're looking at planning analysis of qualitative data. This often involves reviewing notes which can be transcribed from interviews, because remember, a lot of times the collection of data through qualitative analysis or through qualitative design is not as interested as in just counting frequencies. We're getting into details, we're getting into descriptions. So again, in order to really get a description or a pattern, you have to be able to record a sufficient amount of data, and a lot of times that takes place in the form of an interview. So being able to transcribe notes from an interview, very important. If you look over our material as a whole, you look over all of your collected data as a whole, and look at patterns, it's important to be able to articulate them in a way that is coherent and cogent. The book gives an example of a specific hypothesis where women living with HIV were interviewed, and where when the interviews were transcribed and compared, they started to see, the researchers started to see a theme of a reoccurrence in the term abandonment, but then also the whole notion about support of friends. So here we are, concept of abandonment, concept of friends and support from friends, not necessarily family, would be something that could be seen as a pattern. Okay, well, here we go. I'm kind of catching up with myself now. When you're planning analysis of qualitative data, reviewing notes is incredibly important, as I just stated. Organizing files, yes. Coding the data. This is where we're starting to get a little more into recognizing those specific meaning units I talked about, like for example abandonment or supportive friends, things that arise frequently, and beginning to kind of maybe even code them in the data by making notes on them, or maybe extracting them from the original text and putting them together in another document. These are ways you can kind of begin to organize and code the data. Noticing and recording patterns, as I mentioned, is key. Again, the text, our text, talks a lot about noticing items that jump out. Like, for example, the abandonment and the theme of friends in the aforementioned fact pattern. Things that you really kind of notice, that you know, you kind of go, oh, yeah, I'm seeing this quite a few times. Yes, those are the type of things that maybe jump out. All right. Our text recommends keeping a process journal for an audit trail. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, because qualitative data is so open-ended, your credibility is always on the line because, again, there's so many openings for biases to insert themselves. So keeping an audit trail of how you found something, how you're using it, a process journal is something you can use for that task, and typically is crucial to being able to provide credibility. It's something that people who engage in qualitative types of research really embrace a lot. Okay. Again, and the audit trail, as I mentioned, helps to define any issues, flaws, or gaps with the data or the data collection process, which again, this is all about establishing credibility, which you're going to see me talk about quite a bit throughout this. Okay. Oh, and here it is. Here's my example again. I kind of stole my own thunder. Working with women living in with HIV rather, a researcher notices the feelings of abandonment and the importance of friends emerges from the data. Again, these would be things that jump out. These would be things that could be coded later as meaning units, and then maybe even perhaps placed in a category. And more on that in a minute. Okay, oh, here it is. Creating codes and categories for the data. I've been talking about meaning units. Meaning units are kind of the first initial elemental steps, recognizing them. So they're basically what you find in the data. I'll just kind of let this talk for itself for a minute. After noticing reoccurring patterns, researchers begin constructing codes and categories to group data. Yeah, you know, this is what we kind of, this is a little bit parallel with extracting numbers if you're on the quantitative side of things. Okay, our text refers to two distinctive levels of coding the data. Most students find this pretty useful. Gives a little bit of structure and direction to how you would manage data that you collect in a qualitative sense. Okay, oh, here we are. A little comic for you. You're getting a researcher trying to collect data qualitatively. Let me go into the codings for you. I've been talking a lot about meaning units, and meaning units being little pieces of data that you find in interviews or however you went about collecting your data that you begin to see form patterns. I'll give you another example. If I was interviewing folks who were homeless, I might find that there would be, for example, patterns with respect to how people spend their time or how they, for example, try to get means for buying things, purchasing things together. Might be commonalities. Like, for example, recycling cans is something that a lot of folks who are homeless are using. So that would be something that would kind of keep coming up again and again. I guess one meaning unit would be the importance of the income, but then also the methods of the collection would also be relevant as a meaning unit, again, to form patterns among what the people are saying in their interviews. Okay. Determining and naming categories for meaning units. So, you know, we're starting to get a little broader at this point. Once you begin to find that within the interviews or however you collected data, you're finding similar sentences, topics, patterns, themes, whatever. Now you want to start grouping them in categories so that there's a little more coherence to the overall design. And then, you know, you can go another further step out, which is you can even begin assigning codes or shorthand to the categories, like I could equal, like the letter I could equal income for the homeless population example I gave. Or A could equal abandonment. And you're kind of coding all of your data with those little A's or I's or whatever letter you've chosen to help you remember where they're at. And later when you need to comb through the data and collect it, taking actual words and sentences, they're easy to refer to. So again, this is just another part of the process. Refining and reorganizing coding, you may find over time that your codes don't fit as well with certain. In other words, there are other ways to code it that actually seem a little more appropriate. And this is kind of an overarching theme here with qualitative. A lot of times, what you're doing constantly is revising until you get a really good fit of the meaning units, categories, and codes for the data. You may try something at first and find that it just doesn't apply to as many interviews as you had wished, and you might change it up a little bit and see if another type of category fits even better until you can kind of get it right to your liking. Okay, and then the final one is probably the hardest, is deciding when to stop. Anytime something is left open to unlike an equation where we know when we start doing the equation and we know when we finish it, qualitative, again, doesn't really have some finite beginning and ending points. So with qualitative, being able to know when to stop collecting data or coding the data when it becomes exhaustive at some level is really a skill. And I think that's why I think the book considered it part of the first level of coding. Okay. Second level of coding. Now we're getting probably a little more broader now. Retrieving by cutting and pasting, if they're in Word documents of some sort, the actual meaning units, or I guess if you wanted to literally cut and paste, you could do that too. You can cut the actual meaning units of the text into and then place them into categories for documentation. Comparing and contrasting the categories to move into themes. So maybe you have, for example, with the homeless population, you have survival skills that have to do with meeting basic needs. That could be an overarching theme once I've discovered a lot of the things that folks who are homeless are doing to survive. Another theme might be coping skills, which is coping with maybe either symptoms or addictions or anything else that they're wrestling with in addition to having their needs met. So again, we're moving from individual meaning units, which would be the details of the interview, out to a much larger concept of themes. Okay? All right. Now, when you're talking about categories, you may want to recall that not everything is equal in research, especially when it comes to qualitative research, where a lot of times there's some openings for what we call participatory action research. This is where the participants are literally involved with creating parts of the research. Now, from our text, they're talking, Marlowe's talking quite a bit about differences between categories that would be considered maybe more participatory or less. For the types of categories created for qualitative research, she kind of breaks it down into two types: indigenous and researcher-constructed categories. Indigenous categories, which use an IMIC approach, takes the perspective of the participants to create categories. So it's not us as researchers trying to necessarily think up what constitutes a category. We actually use the participants to help with that. The book also talks about a concept called frame elicitation, which asks participants about what should be included in the category. So not only just designing the categories themselves, but what kind of is the range within the categories for the meaning units. Okay. Useful processes. These are useful processes for needs or strengths assessments for community study. Yeah. Again, we're coming back to this notion that the more we can get the participants to be a part of the process, the more buy-in we have, and a lot of times greater reliability and validity. So again, these are really practical concerns as well. Okay, so again, this is kind of just a really broad overview of some terms, and one of them here being indigenous categories, contrasted with here we go. Well, I got a little bit more to say at the indigenous categories. I'm sorry, they did say in the book that the text calls for special attention to follow from the fact that different words can mean the same thing. So it's not always clear what one person says in an interview in terms of a concept that may be very similar to another person, but is worded differently. And being able to sift out those details is a pretty advanced skill. I think explanations for phenomenon in your participants' lives can be complex too. It takes more than just a word or two. So a meaning unit perhaps could be an entire paragraph. Okay, there may be no label for certain concepts. And then finally, categories may overlap. For example, a person who is chronically mentally ill and maybe even homeless could consider a provider, like, for example, a doctor or a psychiatrist or a counselor, to also be part of the medical provision as well. So you've kind of got a dual use of the same meaning unit. You know, the doctor could be part of the person's support. So instead of being purely as a medical provider, you could find that the medical provider was also part of another category, which in this case would be maybe support. Okay, so the text says that group process may help to clarify some of these points. For example, if you got a bunch of people together who are in your population trying to study, and you ask them similar questions and they get a chance to chime in their own words, you get clarification with regard to concepts that may be worded differently among them. However, the book also cautions that group process itself has its own set of dynamics that could impact the process of data collection. So these are all just special considerations for how you design indigenous categories for qualitative research. And finally, creation of categories are an integral part of a field of science inquiry that's called phenomenology. And it really is about inquiring into the experiences of a particular population, which fits very well with what we're trying to do here. So again, just some different words for some of the same concepts here. For researcher-constructed categories, the example that was used in the book was a researcher creates categories to organize meaning units, and in this particular case uses a example of the Insagora or Insagoma. This is basically kind of a traditional healer in the Zulu nation in South Africa. And basically what the researcher does here is looks at the kind of proclamations made by the healer and is able to organize them into categories according to kind of patterns that he or she finds. I thought this was kind of useful. And I really didn't know what the traditional healer maybe looked like, and I went ahead and again, I know maybe Google's not the best example, but I looked for a picture of Insagoma, and I found this, so hopefully this is helpful. I don't know, just kind of illustrates things a little bit better. I'm very curious about different cultures' modes of healing, so naturally I'm interested in studying some of these things. Okay, moving on to the next one, content analysis. Well, in some ways this book I felt like didn't give us, it could have put content analysis in a different spot, but we'll just roll through this for a minute and see how it goes. Content analysis is a very popular qualitative analytical method, and it's something that if you take a look at, it can be very interesting to read in the form of a study. Basically what it involves is researcher constructed categories. So basically the researcher is the one and not exactly the participants, because a lot of times this doesn't deal with interviewing people or conducting panel studies or anything like that. This is where basically the researcher is looking at a large body of already published data, a lot of secondary sources, and is tracking for specific meaning units in those. I see a lot of that going on nowadays. For example, there's a high scrutiny of tweets. I see a lot of content analysis of tweets used by political folks people who are in the news quite a bit get their particular tweets examined over time. So content analysis is one way that very popularly folks use qualitative analytical method in practice. Inferences are made based on occurrences of categories. For example, if you are able to find, for example, patterns in the way that somebody is tweeting, let's just keep with that, about a particular subject, you find patterns there over time, and you can kind of code those in. You can, for example, come up with a category of how it appears in tweets, and then you can begin to look over a greater level of you can look over a greater body of tweets and kind of see what patterns arise after you've kind of coded it. It's kind of fun to do. When we talk about what the text is referring to as content analysis, there are 6 steps that are referred to. This is the Alter and Evans study of 1990. This is where you select and define constructs of interest. I guess you could say negative affect or angry viral tweets. I don't know. Select a unit of analysis. This could be a word, a sentence, a phrase, or whatever to be coded. Define the categories, which are usually mutually exclusive. So there should not be a whole lot of overlap here. Okay, and then test the classification scheme on a document or a recording. It could be a transcription or whatever, and see if you're beginning to see consistency. Again, when we're talking about something that can be done over and over again with similar results, we're saying that there's a higher level of reliability, whereas if there is not, then there's a lower level of reliability, and you might want to consider retesting or even changing the code. Code the text of interest and perform a category count. Yeah, you're literally looking at how often things are appearing and then kind of ranking, if I can say it that way, the importance of, and of course in context, whatever the concept is that you're studying. Here's one for you. Public's voice rarely heard in stories about Trump administration. Okay, so somebody went through, and if you can see at the bottom there in the finer print text, the N, or the number of samples, 3,013 stories. So somebody who had the time and energy and effort went through 3,013 stories and coded, literally coded, stories of Trump administration, percentages of, basically, I imagine this is probably going to be tweets, reports, articles, whatever, regarding things that Trump said or his administration said. And I think the article was trying to point out that the majority of the time it's talking, the Trump faction is talking about itself. And I think the concern was in this report was they were talking about only 5% of the time does it come up with citizen concerns, as you can kind of see from the chart here. And again, this is not to get political or anything like that. I'm just trying to give you a real-world example of a content analysis. All right, so this is something I thought that might be interesting to you. In terms of issues, validity of code, the validity of using codes is always an unknown because these are not scientifically tested. They're just kind of researcher created. So in that way, they can be fairly arbitrary. So validity, to be able to generalize to something larger is pretty limited. With regard to reliability, yeah, I mean, if only one person is coding and creating all the categories and just doing it over and over, there's really nothing to compare against. So there's no point of reference to compare to anything else. So reliability can be an issue here. It can be fairly biased. Next, a strong risk exists for taking coded items out of context. Yeah, like for example, you can even look below, and somebody could critically say, "Well, we never really understood in what way the news media or the congressional Republicans, or or the congressional Democrats were being talked about in the articles. It was just that they were mentioned, so we don't even really know in what context they were talking about." Any of these particular items. They're just being coded for it. That's a content analysis. But again, nothing purely here is without its limitations. Okay. Interpreting qualitative data. We're moving now pretty briskly through this chapter. And we're talking about interpreting qualitative data. You're designing a classification system. We already talked about getting to the point of moving from meaning units up to themes, but then after that designing something that is coherent for a reader to be able to recognize all of the coded data. A classification system is really helpful with this. Developing hypotheses and theories. A lot of times, like I stated earlier, when we're looking at qualitative data and we're examining patterns, frequently from those patterns we begin to develop hypotheses and theories, as opposed to quantitative where we're starting with the hypotheses and theories and then trying to test them. It's, again, traveling two different directions on freeways. That's kind of the way you can look at these as a metaphor. All right. Let's just go a little bit deeper into developing classification systems. When you develop a classification system, there's lots of ways to do it. Our text talks about a number of them. First one is cluster diagrams. I'll get to that in a minute. Matrices, no, not just a popular movie in the late 90s. This is a little more of a organization or classification system that's frequently used in qualitative data analysis. Next, we have counts, which looks a little bit like the content, which, again, that was why I felt like the content analysis was kind of misplaced in the text, but whatever. Metaphors, which are incredibly useful. Missing link type of a system. We'll get to that. And then, of course, contradictory evidence, which you should never, ever, ever neglect or ignore when you're dealing with qualitative approach to collecting and analyzing data. Okay. Oh, here's a cluster diagram. It's not a very good one. But you can see where, for example, if dogs and cats were the focus of a study, they tend to be the larger circles here on the cluster. And then all of the things that are around them are characteristics, or you could kind of consider them to be adjunct meaning units that maybe overlap or are specific to each one of them. So this is a really kind of simple and not really great example, but this is what a cluster diagram would look like. So if you're trying to present something for people to consume in terms of your research, creating a cluster whereby categories are made with circles with smaller adjoining circles according to importance is an easy way for a reader's eye to kind of conceive of how all of the pieces you found are put together. Matrices, here we are. They usually consist of tables with columns and rows of categorized qualitative data. Look at this one. In this particular one, there was a study done about attitudes towards exams with contrasting type of experiences from the students and the lecturers. Notice in the first row, attitudes towards exam, students kind of perceive the exams as a mean to reject struggling students. Okay, well that's the perspective or the phenomenon experienced by the students. The lecturers see it more as motivating efforts in learning. Again, we're not dealing with numbers here. We're dealing with categories, and we're dealing with people's experiences in detail to the categories. So this would be an example of a classification system, a matrix rather, under the category of matrices, whereby you can begin to categorize all of your data in ways that, as a reader, I can look at and go, oh, this makes sense. I can kind of see how this all fits together. So it's, again, another way of formalizing all of the data that's been collected. And then let's just look at the next row. Attitudes towards study. Well, students say should not be balanced and not excessive. And lecturers see it as students learn new concepts only if they study vigorously. Well, again, very different ideas about the same thing, but it's illustrated through a contrast in the qualitative expressions of both groups. Okay, counts. Well, we already went over content analysis a little bit earlier today, and this is very similar. Counts are register. They register frequency of occurrences of meaning units, categories, and codes in the data. Again, I sure wish that content analysis had been included here, but oh, wrong count. Sorry. Here's more of a code count. This would be something where somebody did the example on the right would be an example of something where somebody had designed pre-existing categories. So a researcher basically constructed categories and then had gone through a series of data to kind of code for the frequency at which these categories appeared. This is another example of a count, and frequently these are used in qualitative data analysis and design. Metaphors. I love these, as you can tell. Metaphor is usually when you have something that stands in for something else conceptually. I didn't really like the examples given in the book, so I just went out and found my own. Metaphors, they creatively depict other concepts. These can be used to illustrate categories, codes, and themes or ideas. For example, if you take a look at this picture, the conscious mind is not a writer, but in this particular case, the conscious mind is a writer, whereas the subconscious mind is an elephant. So it's demonstrating a relationship between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind using a metaphor, something that's not the same but conceptually related. Another one that I like to use, and I recorded this in my notes, if you were talking to a group of teenage participants in a group that was dealing with anger management, the metaphor of flooding could be a good one. For example, flooding with anger. Okay, well, it might feel like you're flooding. You're not literally flooding, but it's a great metaphor because it's something that illustrates a concept beyond the concept itself. But, you know, it's easy to understand that illustration or understand that depiction of it. Qualitative data, I think, thrives on use of metaphors. Missing link. Gaps in qualitative data that have a common denominator. So another form of interpretation or analysis of qualitative data is when you begin to look at different patterns, and then you become familiar with patterns within those patterns, or find where certain patterns are linked by overlapping concepts. This type of strategy is called missing link. It's just another way that we analyze qualitative data because we're not using equations. But it's useful for a reader to kind of look at how you've analyzed the gaps in the data and maybe have come up with some ideas or some hypotheses for why things are the way they are. Contradictory evidence. This is data that refutes or contradicts other collected data. Okay, I want to stress again, our text, well, stresses that this evidence should not easily be disregarded or discarded. I should have said discarded, not discarded. It should have been discarded. Sorry about that. Shouldn't be disregarded or discarded. Contradictory evidence is kind of a look into competing evidence, which in your final analysis could be used in a rival hypothesis. We'll get to rival hypotheses in a minute, but contradictory evidence in qualitative data is very important. And there's a bias in the human mind and it's basically been called in studies confirmation bias, which is we have an almost unconscious sense of wanting to collect and amass evidence or information that supports whatever we're trying to say and dismiss or ignore any kind of evidence that cuts against us. If you've ever had an argument with a friend or a significant other or whoever, you notice that you spend a lot of time really trying to hammer home those points that support what you're saying, whereas you try to minimize or try to ignore or discard other evidence that cuts against it. Well, in qualitative data, you really don't want to do that. That really cuts against your own credibility, and as remaining as transparent as you can as a researcher for qualitative data, you're really only helping yourself in your study. So again, this is all to say that contradictory evidence should not be ignored in the context of qualitative data. Okay. Now we get into developing hypotheses. We have the information collected. We have run some coding systems, moved out to categories and themes, maybe done some classification of the data in a way that folks can consume it more easily. We may have worked into finding some different ways of expressing the different kinds of data we have. Now we start to develop hypotheses and theories. Remember, I told you that we're trying to move toward this ultimately. qualitative data analysis does not abandon causality altogether. It's just that causality from a qualitative sense is sometimes a lot more circular, whereas with quantitative data, it's usually a lot more linear. Causal, that's not casual, causal flowcharts can be used to illustrate or demonstrate causation in patterns. I have one here for you. Supply, seizures, heroin stock, use, addicts. See how it's kind of some circles running around? This is not a very linear but a circular type of flow chart. This illustrates kind of a causal flow chart where we kind of suspect things to happen, or at least we're hypothesizing things based on patterns we've seen. When we've arrived at this after analyzing all of the data available, this is something that you can kind of generate as a heuristic and can be very useful for your analysis as well. Okay, when you want to validate qualitative data, there are 5 particular ways that the book goes through and recommends considering. First is rival or alternative hypotheses. Second is negative cases. Third is triangulation. Fourth is preservation of context and content, hopefully, and establishing credibility, which I've been talking about throughout this entire presentation. Okay, rival or alternative hypotheses, what are these? Well, they a lot of times originate from the collected data, or maybe they're already out there in your literature. Maybe as part of your literature review, you came up with a hypothesis that actually is looking at something that you're looking at in your study and has a different idea about the patterns and the causality or the flow of the patterns that a little bit contradictory to your own. That's okay. That's okay. What you're doing with qualitative is analyzing the data and then basically seeing which fits better. That's ultimately where you're kind of arriving in your final analysis. A lot of times rival or alternative hypotheses, not surprisingly, offer alternative explanations for the patterns. I kind of mentioned that a minute ago. These shouldn't be in any way, shape, or form discarded. They need to be considered. It only adds to your validation and your credibility. I said this. This time I got it right. It said disregarded, not discarded. Okay. Next, can be analyzed for comparison with formulated hypotheses. Yeah, I'm kind of saying the same things over again. Rival or alternative hypotheses stand as kind of a comparison for what you found in your own data, so that you can begin to put a context in place for explanations for the patterns, observations for the context, that type of thing. Again, a lot of times in qualitative data, causality is very circular. It's not, again, linear. So there could be a lot of ideas about, from a rival or alternative hypothesis perspective, what things are doing and how come. I liked this little picture I got here. Look at this in terms of rival or alternative hypotheses. Lots of ways to kind of consider how things happen. I guess you can go over the wall, under the wall, or through the wall. If somebody ends up on one side of the wall or the other side of the wall, there's explanations for a number of ways that this could have happened. So these are all, I thought this was kind of a clever little picture there that comported nicely with rival or alternative hypothesis. Okay, negative cases. Well, let's talk about those. Negative cases are exceptions to cases that illustrate the identified patterns, specifically ones you found. You may find in your data that a certain group of people does things very commonly the same way. Like, if going back to my use of folks who are chronically mentally ill, or severely mentally ill and chronically homeless, you may find some consistencies in patterns of behavior, but then find another case for somebody who's doing something totally different or has a different meaning for behavior. And that would be kind of what was considered to be a negative case. It goes against the identified pattern. It's an exception to the cases that illustrate your identified pattern. They invite greater critical examination about your findings. They force you to be a little more introspective about, causality, again, which, we can challenge quite a bit. need to be accounted for in the written report, not ignored. Yeah, again, that's a theme throughout this particular chapter that I think is very strong. I would include negative cases in my research, and I would not necessarily spend a lot of time trying to refute them, but I would give them a little bit of credence and say, well, this is something that has come up in the data and should be accounted for, and let's consider it. So negative cases are not enemies. They actually, again, help build your credibility. Oh, here we go. A little picture here. Yeah, kind of outlying cases. You have the A, C, and D, which look about the same. But then B, oh, that's something totally different. Well, I don't think you can refute those. I think this illustration kind of is nice to look at and consider the fact that negative cases are, in fact, very important to qualitative analysis. Triangulation. This is a lot like it sounds. This is validating patterns that you found in your collected data through using other data methods or research. So it could even include qualitative or quantitative research. So a way to triangulate something you found qualitatively could be to study it quantitatively too. And if you find something that you can mesh up and find consistent between the qualitative and the quantitative, well, then you have a stronger case made for your analysis. You can employ different people or theories that look at the data in a different way but come up with similar patterns or findings. That's another way to triangulate. Again, getting out of the hermitage of your own habits and your own thoughts is sometimes one way to increase credibility when you're discussing and analyzing a theory or formulating a hypothesis. Look at this. Triangulation in action. Multiple methods, multiple researchers, multiple theories, multiple data sets. Do you see the theme? The theme is that, again, relying exclusively on your own type of study can sometimes be short-sighted. It's very helpful to sometimes find something adjunct to it that's also looking at the same thing and maybe having the same or even different ideas about it. Again, credibility is king or queen when it comes to qualitative data. Preservation of context. Well, again, qualitative analysis is all about study in context. Context at all points in the analysis and presentation of the information you found should be in context. And I have a nice little picture here I thought you'd like when I get to it in a minute. This adds a dimension to validate your research. Yes, absolutely. Remember, because the information exists in a specific context, it is nearly impossible to generalize. Yeah, it really is. And remember, qualitative is not about trying to generalize to a larger population as much as it is trying to begin to detect patterns in context. Look at this picture. Context matters. Well, each one of these folks is looking at a specific portion of the elephant. But put in context, you have to have all the pieces to see the full picture. This is a pretty nice illustration of how we can kind of understand context and how in qualitative research you always are striving to present the context of the information so that things don't get overly isolated or alienated from the bigger picture, causing a distortion effectively. Establishing credibility. I thought you'd like this little gauge. When it comes to establishing credibility, because qualitative, again, is such an open-ended endeavor, we always have to be mindful of how we're operating as an individual researcher and considering ways of safeguarding our process from, well, ourselves. The credibility of the study should be safeguarded with thorough documentation. Should be not through, but thorough documentation. This could be a process journal. This could be any kind of set of notes that you took along the way that helps be critical of your process to make sure that there were not as many openings as you maybe wanted for bias to seep in, or at least you can recognize the biases if they're occurring and maybe do some kind of course correction. Finally, keeping organized notes of your process, like I just stated a minute ago, is essential. Again, we're talking about being able to be more credible through your process than less credible. Okay, and again, because qualitative is so open-ended, yes, you need that credibility. Okay, writing the qualitative report. these are not the only ones available. Their book even makes that point. They say these are just a couple of ideas about how people in the past have created qualitative reports. They've done it through case studies, through analytical studies, and through ethnographies. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. It's more like a partial list, a very partial list. So let's take a look at these. Okay, case studies. Well, for documentation, this method involves using a specific case to epitomize a studied phenomenon through a particular event, a person, an institution. We're kind of, again, epitomizing what we're trying to study through a specific case. Now, that doesn't mean that when you're writing everything up, you can't bring in other cases. It's just you have like a chief case that you're tracking in the literature, or I'm sorry, in your documentation, and you're trying to create a sense in the reader of what these patterns look like through looking at one person or one event or one institution rather than a multitude, but you can interject at different times collateral information you have as well. So it's not mutually exclusive. Can be chronological or thematic in nature. Yeah, I mean, case studies can track something in terms of over time, somebody who's struggling with a specific problem, or thematic, a certain occurrence in life that's common or common to a specific population. Can be illustrated through documentation in a case study in this way. Analytical studies. Exploring the relationship between the variables studied. We did a lot of this already. I mean, this is kind of like, what do I say in the next bullet point? A narration of a cluster diagram. If you have an illustration in your research of a cluster diagram and you're narrating it and you're talking about all of the relationships and the larger circles in relationship to the smaller circles and how there's either overlap or there is exclusion or any kind of relationship or interrelationship among the variables, you're doing an analytical study. Okay, this would all be included in the findings chapter. That's chapter 4 of your overall study. Ethnographies. Well, social work kind of borrowed these a bit. Usually a qualitative report about a particular culture. These are typically found in the domain of anthropology more often than not. Very popular in that discipline. They are reports that tend to be very long and detailed in anthropology, but for social work, we kind of made a smaller scale. We have like what the book called mini kind of ethnographies, which again we would use to document particular patterns in a group or a population. But of course, I caution you, please be careful with this, because again, the idea here is not to stereotype. There's plenty of diversity within diversity. There's plenty of variety within variety. So I would at all times keep that as kind of a theme, a running theme in any research I was doing if I was doing it from this perspective. At the end of the chapter, we usually get to ethical issues, which I always find important, and I try to highlight whenever I can. Remember, with qualitative research, there's always a greater opportunity to distort validity through researcher biases. That's why you have to be a little more careful here when it comes to conducting thorough qualitative research. Biases may be intentionally or unwillingly expressed. You might not even know you're doing it. It may be so much a part of you to think a certain way that you're characterizing a group or a behavior pattern in a way that to you seems very natural to see it that way, but actually can be perpetuating stereotypes. Frequently attempts to disregard, minimize, or ignore contradictory evidence is where biases appear. I talked about earlier in this, I talked about confirmation bias, which is, of course, the very human tendency to minimize or negate or discard evidence that stacks against us, where we also have the corresponding tendency to emphasize, maximize, propagate any kind of evidence that works for us. Again, these are all self-awareness issues. They are very important and really do need to be considered. Okay. Finally, including participants to review the data and give feedback is a simple safeguard. It's something that you can use once you've begun to collect the data and you're starting to do some write-ups. If you go back to your participants and say, did I get this right? Does this look right to you? Does this comport with what what we're talking about, because it was filtered through me. So can you give me some feedback here about whether or not I got it right? This is a great way to begin to check and balance any biases that might begin to emerge or bleed through the research. Human diversity. Yeah, well, take a look at this. I was talking earlier about qualitative analyses and how biases may also show up in stereotypical depictions of population studied. So if you're a reader and you're reading about a culture, you might find that whatever the researcher says is the ultimate depiction. But in fact, again, there's so much diversity within diversity. It would be like using just a open-ended term like Caucasian or African American. I mean, there's so much diversity within even those two phrases or those two populations that to just try to create a report on just one in one way is really kind of selling the remainder of the culture short, and it really isn't that helpful. So again, that's why I think we have to take extra care when we're doing qualitative analyses. Keeping aware of power dynamics that influence dominant culture ideology is very important here. Again, whether we know it or not, everyone's worldviews are constructed and filtered through a lot of different paradigms, and those have overlays of our individual cultures that we come from in our families, in our larger social networks, in our religions, in our social networks, in our country. So again, I think being able to understand as well as you can how your own influences are influencing how you're seeing something is a great safeguard against minimizing people who are the object of your study. So again, human diversity issues, very important, probably should be done. We should probably talk about these at the beginning rather than the end, but I tried to interlace these concepts throughout. So this was my first attempt at trying to do anything online, so hopefully it resonates, hopefully it wasn't too boring, hopefully it wasn't confusing. So I'm going to leave it now. I want you to, again, consider this to be in lieu of a class we would have had together. I'm going to put more PowerPoints up today, and I'd like you to look at those two before our next class. So again, thank you so much. I'll be eager to hear your feedback about this. Whatever you want to tell me is fine. Okay, thanks so much, everybody.